understanding human psychology is complicated. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that trying to understand the motivations behind human behavior is difficult. You see, there are many things that require consideration. Consideration of upbringing, genetics, influence of society, biological mechanisms, moral constructs, and more. And in this video, we will examine the role of gender and culture. Given that the title of this unit is Issues and Debates, and having already examined the debates, it is only fitting that I introduce you to the issues of psychology. But at first, what is an issue in psychology? An issue in psychology refers to a source of conflict that, if ignored, could undermine the values of our theory and research. That is to say, if we carry out research without addressing these potential sources of conflict, it could have far-reaching consequences that could negatively impact individuals, communities, and science of psychology itself. Again, to help you grasp a better picture of how ignoring potential conflicts could potentially result in negative consequences, we return to our examination of Ted Bundy. In the previous video, one of the things mentioned was that his mistrust towards women likely stemmed from his childhood. You see, Bundy grew up believing that his mother was actually his sister. Born at a home for unwed mothers, Ted was nearly placed up for adoption by his mother, Louise. However, Louise's parents were keen for Ted to be part of the family, and so, for the first few years of his life, he was raised by his maternal grandparents and adopted their surname, Nelson, to avoid the social stigma that accompanied birth outside of wedlock. Biographer and true crime writer Anne Rule, who knew Bundy personally, notes that he told her he'd seen through the lie, stating, "Maybe I just figured out that there couldn't be 20 years difference in age between a brother and a sister, and Louise always took care of me. I just grew up knowing that she was really my mother." According to Rule, Bundy expressed a lifelong resentment towards his mother for never talking to him about his real father, and for leaving him to discover his true parentage for himself. A few years later, at the urging of multiple family members, Louise and Ted left Philadelphia to live with cousins, something that Ted struggled with, though not as much as when Louise met and got involved with Johnny Bundy, an army hospital cook. Louise and Johnny married in 1951, and, jealous of his mother's new relationship, Bundy had a deliberate public tantrum at Sears, wetting his pants as part of the display. This didn't keep Louise's new husband from adopting her son and giving him the name that would become notorious years later. There were surface tensions between Bundy and his mother, who always made sure he was physically cared for, but she went on to have 4 more children, so her attention was divided. After Bundy's capture, he expressed a feeling of being unloved, and his illegitimacy was another sore spot in their relationship. It wasn't just his relationship with his mother that was the only female relationship he struggled with. In high school, he was a loner who went on only one date. He later explained, "It wasn't that I disliked women or were afraid of them. It was just that I didn't seem to have an inkling as to what to do about them. In his final interview, Bundy also talked about how his early exposure to pornography led to an over-sexualization of women. He talked about how unfulfilling addiction of porn led to a seeking out of a more potent and graphic material. In high school, Bundy was known for reading pulpy detective fiction stories with gore-filled depictions of rape and murder. So how does this tie into our first issue? Well, Bundy's early experiences with women, especially his mother, seem to have been displaced onto other women. His poor maternal attachment led to a bias against women where he unfairly judged them purely for their shared gender with his mother, even though the fault was not at the hands of women, rather at the hands of his upbringing. This is an example of a gender bias. Such biases also exist in the world of psychology, where psychological research or a theory has a view that does not justifiably represent the experience and behavior of men or women. And this is where we find the first source of conflict. It doesn't take much to see that Bundy's unresolved resentment towards his mother and women led to disastrous consequences. Another example of a potential gender bias would be to use the case of Bundy to make generalizations about all psychopaths. The problem is, there are some distinct differences between female and male psychopaths, and to assume that Bundy's characteristics are general to the wider population could cause potential problems in the form of a misdiagnosis of a female psychopath. On a similar level to gender bias, cultural bias also exists within psychology. It is where we might have a tendency to ignore cultural differences and interpret all phenomena through the lens of one's own culture. This would be perhaps like trying to find the traits of an Asian psychopath through Bundy's patterns of behavior. Given that the values of the East and West can be quite different, it does not make sense to use Bundy as a benchmark for all psychopaths in every culture. It is often quite dangerous to blanket compare different cultures without first recognizing what makes them unique from one another. Mistakes in the past have led to disastrous consequences in the form of biased research influencing public policy, which leads to our final issue. The ethical implication of psychological research extends far beyond ensuring the safety of those participating in research. Of course, that is not to say protecting participants isn't important. One only needs to see the catastrophic consequences on participants of the CIA's testing of mind control in Project MKUltra. These experiments, designed to weaken the subject's mental state and brain functions, involved many dangerous and illegal methods. However, the consequences of research surpass the participant to that of society. When all your research is completed and your results are published, how will your research be interpreted and used by the scientific community, media, and wider society? If perhaps a researcher was to conclude that, after studying Ted Bundy, psychopathy could only be found in white, young American males who had a strained relationship with their mother, similar to Bundy, it could have far-reaching consequences when it comes to public policy. Boys who might fit the profile might be unfairly subjected to scrutiny and discrimination. As such, research examining race, sexuality, intelligence, and criminality are often seen as taboo given their past of informing bad public policy. However, just because some aspects of psychology have a dark past, it shouldn't lead to psychologists shying away from research that is socially sensitive. In fact, because of the undoubted importance of such research, psychologists may have a social responsibility to carry it out, ensuring they have an unbiased and reflexive practice. This then concludes the introduction to issues of psychology, gender bias, cultural bias, and the ethical implications of psychological research. This was a very brief overview of the different issues in psychology, and I will cover these in substantially more detail in future video essays. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the definitive channel for everything A-level psychology.